You're watching the video sermon podcast of First Baptist Church of Marble Falls, Texas. For almost 130 years, FBCMF has served Marble Falls and the greater Highland Lakes area faithfully through children's programs, youth activities, and adult discipleship. We invite you to join us each and every Sunday morning at 9 and 10:30 a.m. for deep fellowship, rich worship, and a spirit-filled message. For those who find themselves unable to attend on a Sunday morning, we stream those services. Simply visit fbcmf.live during either of our service times to view it. Never miss an archived sermon by subscribing to this podcast on YouTube by visiting youtube.com/FBCMFtube. And to learn more about our church or to listen to an audio-only version of this and other sermons, please visit us online at fbcmf.org. What if I told you there was a world beyond our own? A place full of mystery and things that you and I would never deem possible by logical standards. And what if this place was close enough to where you and I are now, that its entrance was just on the other side of belief, waiting to be discovered? C.S. Lewis asked some of the same questions that you and I ask right now in his Chronicles of Narnia. And through those stories, he invites us all into the wardrobe.
We are in a sermon series called Stepping into the Wardrobe. We are taking 8 of the images that C.S. Lewis gives to us in his book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and we are using those 8 images to help us to understand a little bit more and a little bit more deeply about some very special spiritual truths that God gives to us in His Word. So far, we have looked at the reality of the invisible spiritual realm that's all around us. We have looked at the devil and thought about who the devil is and how the devil is against us and what it takes for us to resist and to overcome the devil's work in our own life. Last week, we talked about the role of the pastor and the relationship that the pastor has with the church. But this week is my very favorite, and I'm extremely excited about it because today, all we are talking about is celebrating and knowing more deeply Jesus Christ as our Lord. As we talk about it, I would like to use the main character in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the character of Aslan the lion. When the book was first read to me a long time ago, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Aslan was presented, and I had never had a chance to see the movie. All I had were the words of the narrative itself, painting the images of this magnificent lion. In my mind as a child, the lion was as big as this room. And if he would roar, if you were anywhere close to it, it would burst your eardrums. It would be so loud. His magnificence, his strength was unbelievable. As we read it and we think about Narnia and Aslan, the Narnians loved him, but also the Narnians feared Aslan. His power and his might just made him an unstoppable force. And in the story, Aslan gives his own life for all of Narnia, and in particular for a little boy named Edmund. And before he magnificently comes back to life, the White Witch, after she kills Aslan, she thinks that Aslan is dead and that she is won. And right when she thinks that she's about to take over everything, she's about to win and be triumphant, Aslan mightily comes back to life and faces her on the battlefield, which is the best part, because when Aslan comes out to face her, it's really no battle at all. It is no competition. Aslan runs and he mauls the White Witch to death. And everybody says, amen. It makes me want to sing a hymn when I hear it. But it's at that moment when Aslan comes with his wrath and all of his strength, when he comes like that, where we are forced to reconcile two things. Because up until that point, we were introduced to Aslan's gentleness, his love, his compassion, and he was huge, no doubt. You didn't want to make him mad. You always felt like if the top would blow off, you would be in a lot of trouble. But we never saw it. We were never exposed to it. All we knew was his gentleness. And then all of a sudden, in this moment, we see him in all of his might, untamable. His wrath and his strength at that moment. And we learned that this character, Aslan, is not a one-dimensional character after all. There's a whole lot more to him. And that's why toward the end of the novel, there is this saying about Aslan that became kind of famous throughout Christian circles, talking about God. And it was in reference to this lion. And they said this: "He is not a tame lion, but he is good." He is not a tame lion, but he is good. And I've thought a whole lot about it, and I've wondered, is it true? When we say that about God, is it true about God? Is it biblical about God? Does the Bible give this kind of image of a tameless, passionate, strong kind of God? And as we read Scripture, and as I think about this idea, he is not a tame lion, can we apply this to God, that he's not a tame God, but a good God? And there's a passage of Scripture that has come to my mind, and I want to talk to you about it, and maybe you can help me with it today. In Mark 11, you heard it read just a moment ago by Amy, and it starts out on a very normal kind of day. Jesus and his entourage are going into Jerusalem, and they're going into the temple courts. And as they get in there, he encounters something, and then everything begins to change completely. The next scene pictures a very fierce Jesus overthrowing all of the tables and making a whip and swinging it around and whipping and yelling and chasing everybody out like a madman. Jesus is chasing everybody out of the temple. And yes, this is the same Jesus who bounces children on his knee. I wonder if after this moment, when the disciples were engaging Jesus, if somebody began to act in a way that was frustrating, if the disciples would say, let's try not to upset him, shall we? We know what he is capable of now. We always felt it. We always sensed that there was more to him, and now we saw it, and it opened up, and we see it. John, in his gospel, introduces this shocking idea of a wild, untamable Jesus at the very beginning of his gospel, as if John, in the Gospel of John, there is no bait and switch. When you begin reading it, he talks about it at the very beginning. Here's who you're about to read about. He'll overturn your tables, but be careful. You just keep reading and you'll see. But John is not chronologically accurate. He doesn't care to be chronologically accurate. He puts this thing at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry to help us to be introduced to somebody at the very beginning of his gospel. But Mark, thinking, when exactly does Jesus do this, puts it right after the triumphal entry, and it's probably more accurate to history here and when it occurred, right after the triumphal entry, but right before the cross and the resurrection. Kind of as if to say that this man who is about to die is no pushover of a man. And so here's the scene. Jesus goes into the temple and he gets into the outer courts. He doesn't go into the building itself, but he's in the outer courts all around. It's kind of like several football fields. And it's not like he went into your church and started doing all of these things. He's on the outside in the outer courts. And in this large plaza, there are people who are selling animals, and there are people who are like human ATMs, that if you come to them with some amount of money, they'll exchange it for you, and they'll give you the right amount. Those guys are there, but the people who are selling the animals, and the whole thing really had become a very lucrative kind of business, and the reason that they needed the animals was to give a sacrifice right there at the temple. And so they had these animals, and they were charging exorbitant, extortionate even kind of prices for these animals. And remember, the Jewish people were poor. They were already being taxed by the Romans. And now they were having to pay all of this money to try and just do a sacrifice. And it infuriated Jesus, because Jesus is always on the side of the poor. Always. He has a special place in his heart. He hates things that are unjust. And everybody knew that this was wrong, but nobody could do anything about it. It would have taken somebody very strong to stop this whole situation. And something that makes it much, much worse is that in this outer court is where all the Gentiles would come as well. And it was a horrible testimony to the Gentiles. It would be like if any of you are visiting with our church today, and we want to do our very best to demonstrate to you who God is in our life, but when you come in, there's dysfunction, and we're mad at each other, and people aren't communicating or talking to each other. It doesn't feel loving. The music isn't anything, and people are just kind of walking out, not paying attention. What it would communicate to anybody visiting is that we don't care that much about God. We don't care that much about church. It's a horrible witness. And so in the same way, for them, there was one true God, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and he wasn't like the pagan gods. He was holy, meaning set apart. He's different than all of the other pagan gods. He was special. But when the Gentiles came in, and they saw the way that they were worshiping Yahweh, it appeared to them as their kind of worship was identical or very similar to the kind of worship that the pagans were doing, that there was no difference to them. And so that's why Jesus began talking while he is doing all of this. As Jesus is whipping and turning over tables, he also starts preaching to them. I don't know if your parents ever did that. Did they preach to you while they were spanking you at the same time? Jesus is yelling with the whip, and he's kicking over the tables, and he starts preaching to all of them in the middle of it. And part of the message is really about this issue of there are Gentiles here. There are visitors here. What is it demonstrating about God when you do this? Here's what he said. He quotes Isaiah 56, and he says this house, and picture it in a loud voice, and he's yelling as a whip, this house is supposed to be a house of prayer for all of the nations. There are strangers here watching you from the nations. And because of that, the things that happen in this temple communicate to those people something special. We're supposed to be a particular witness to the world, a grand and beautiful witness that when people come in and they see what we do, they say it's different here. We've never seen anything like this in our whole life. This is amazing, and it makes them want to draw close to God. It makes them want to take steps toward him, not run out and run away, but what they were doing, it was they were giving an appearance that God was not holy at all. And the reason is because his worshipers were behaving so badly. It demonstrated a pathetic God who is okay with greed and might even be greedy himself. Can you just feel Jesus' blood beginning to boil? There's injustice on one side, and there is a picture of God on the other that's a horrible picture. And then we think, well, at least all the priests were getting it right, but they weren't. It wasn't just about the money changers and about the people selling animals. On top of all of that, these priests, what they were doing is poor people would come in to get the sacrifice, and they had no money to go to the money changers with. So they would go to the priests, and they would say, we're out of money, but we need to offer a sacrifice. Could you lend us money from the temple? And so the priests would go in, and they would bring out money, and they would give it to people, but they would record their names, and they would say, you're going to owe the temple, and we're going to charge you interest for it. And so they had to give a sacrifice for their sin, but they were going into debt because of it. And so these people, they had a tab at the temple. And the priests were recording all of that. Later on, the Jewish historian Josephus said that people were in debt to the priests because the priests were in the business too. They were the ones lending the money to the people at an interest so that the people could do what God had commanded them to do. It was as if the priests themselves were loan sharks. Y'all, when we read this, I've heard some people try to say, that's the reason that no churches should ever have a bookstore, or no churches should ever sell anything. That is a bad application. The issue here, this case is against the entire worship. It was against the whole religious atmosphere of everybody. It was hurting everyone, and it was destroying the reputation of God. And so the unexpected begins to happen. And it might not be that unexpected to us after we have heard all of this, but for them, Jesus goes off. The righteous anger inside of him just kind of explodes, and he starts turning over all of these tables, running around, yelling at everybody, seeming almost crazy, and he gets a whip. He makes it, and he starts whipping. We don't know that he whipped the people, but he could have, as he's swinging it all around. And what he does is he brings the worship to a screeching halt. No sacrifices could be made. It would be like we're coming in here for worship and somebody stops everything that we have going on. You can't go worship today. There is no worship because the way that you're worshiping is wrong. And so I'm stopping worship. What could be more humiliating than in the middle of our worship service if God said, I will not let you keep going because of the way you're doing it? What's in your heart? Everything that's happening is wrong. It's not the way I wanted it to be. You have messed up in all of this. I won't let you come to church today. Stay outside. Jesus brought all of their worship to a halt. And then he starts talking about the real reason that's behind it, the emotional fierceness that's driving Jesus to do this. And he says this, you have made my Father's house a den of robbers. And when he says that, it's not just a offensive kind of term. He is quoting the Old Testament. There's a moment in the Old Testament, in Jeremiah 7, where something that was happening at the temple was so bad, and the priests were involved in it. Everyone is involved, and it was so bad that God allowed the whole temple to be destroyed because of it. And it's recorded in Jeremiah 7, and here is what the text says, and this is what Jesus began to quote. And y'all, he could have quoted the whole thing, and all Mark did was just put the little bit of the den of robbers into it. But know this, if somebody comes into your church, if somebody went into the temple and starts quoting Jeremiah 7, the priests are not going to like it. He says, will you steal, murder, and commit adultery, and swear falsely, and offer sacrifices to Baal, and walk after other gods that you may have not known, and then you come here and you stand before me in this house, meaning the temple of God? And then he says, this house of mine, which is called by my name, and you say, well, we're delivered, that you may do all of these abominations. You think that your nice worship is going to cover you when you bring all of that into my temple? Has this house, which has been called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? Well, behold, I've seen it. You may not recognize it. God is saying, I see it, declares the Lord. And right after this, Jeremiah says that the Babylonians came in 586 and they annihilated it. No more temple, no more worship after that. So picture Jesus, he comes into the temple. They've rebuilt it at this time. It is a new rebuilt temple. Jesus comes in, he's turning over all the tables, and he starts quoting Jeremiah 7. And they're like, what are you saying? By quoting Jeremiah 7, Jesus is saying, what you are doing here is like what they were doing in history, and therefore, God is going to do here the same that he did back then. History is going to repeat itself. It's as if he's saying, I have to stop this. If I don't stop all that's going on in this place of worship, God is about to destroy it all. We're about to lose everything. If one more second of it goes on, everyone's going to be destroyed. I have to bring an end to what is happening right here. The reason that Jesus does it is not to destroy the worship, but it was to save them. And what was about to happen? Saving them is the reason. A few years ago, I read a story about a man who linebacker tackled another man in the middle of a street, bringing him to the ground with such force that it cracked his skull. And you wonder, well, why does he tackle him? And I keep reading, and it was because the man was not paying attention, and he had his back turned, and a car was about to hit him. Another man sees him and very spontaneously runs, and he tackles him into the ground to try to knock him out of the way of the car. It takes force to save somebody's life sometimes. You see, if they didn't change during this moment in Mark 11, if the people didn't change, they would have been destroyed. Jesus had to stop what they were doing. His wrath is actually for them. I heard a story about Billy Graham, that he was having a crusade in the Deep South, and he's in this huge auditorium, and they had a big section roped off. And he said, well, what's that section right there for? And they said, well, that's where blacks are going to be. And Billy Graham said, you mean it's going to be segregated? And they said, well, yes, that's the way we do it. And so he goes over, and in his anger, he tears down all of the dividers and all of the things that were separating everybody. I submit to you this: love is turning over tables. That if there is a barrier between us and God, who's going to be the one to tear it down? Who's strong enough? Strong enough to tear it down? Who's strong enough to overturn the tables that sometimes we have set up between us and God and us and ourselves? And we set them up. We give a lot of time and effort to them. Who's strong enough to come in and overturn all of it for our benefit? Only a fierce God. Only a God that Proverbs 1:7, and this is the theme of all of Proverbs, it says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And that's why we consider this, that when we think about all the forces of evil that are against us and the power of the devil that's against us, isn't it nice, y'all, to have somebody that is stronger than the devil on our side? Who is willing, and not just willing, but he's capable of breaking anything down that hurts us and kills us. And when it comes to the devil and all of his schemes and all of his attacks, I'm telling you, we don't need a wimpy God. I saw a picture of of Jesus that doesn't appeal to me at all. Here it is. That's not appealing. It's not accurate for many, many reasons. But one is that we need a Lord that is strong and capable of coming and fighting on our behalf. I don't think that guy'd fight anybody. We're not saved by a wimpy Jesus. Have any of you ever had a moment when a loving but powerful man in your life ever, through his strength, used his strength on your behalf? A father or a grandfather, perhaps, somebody that came in with power and he put something and fixed something that was hurting you. Maybe a woman did it. When I was in the 7th grade, there was a kid who stole my shoes. my tennis shoes. I knew he did it. Everybody knew he did it. I told the teachers, I told everybody, and nobody did anything about it until my mom showed up and started turning over tables. And I got the shoes back. We need a powerhouse God who will come crashing in like a freight train. We need a Jesus Christ who will turn and kick over tables on our behalf. There's an amazing song about it. And Jessa knows it. And I wonder, Jessa, if you would come out and sing this for us.
He ain't trying to write a #1 song. He don't care if the radio plays him. He won't ever stop saying mysterious things. He don't worry about coming on strong. He's not trying to offend you, but he'll do what he has to, whatever trouble it brings. But if the devil himself comes against you, there is nobody else that can defend you. He is not safe. He's not supposed to be. You're gonna want somebody wild and dangerous on your side when you face your one true enemy. Only a fierce and reckless love is gonna save your life. The Lord is good, but make no mistake, He is not safe. And if he ever gets a mega church crowd, he can take a sack lunch and feed them. Oh, but if he starts preaching, you'll never know what he'll say. 'Cause every word coming out of his mouth is like a sword with two sharp edges. Yes, mercy is a dangerous message, but it's the only way. And if the devil himself comes against you, there is nobody else that can defend you. Oh, he is not safe. He's not supposed to be. You're gonna want somebody wild and dangerous on your side when you face your one true enemy. Only a fierce and reckless love is gonna save your life. The Lord is good, but make no mistake, He is not out to get you. He's not keeping score, but He refuses to let you be captive anymore. And He knows the price of freedom is the shedding of His blood, and He's deadly serious about His love. He is not safe. He's not supposed to be. You're gonna want somebody wild and dangerous on your side when you face your one true enemy. Only a fierce and reckless love is gonna save your life. The Lord, He is good, but make no mistake, He is not safe. Oh, He is not safe.
I believe that the most wrathful thing that God ever did was die on the cross. I believe to have all of the anger about our sin poured out on Jesus Christ, and for him to turn and say, it's not you that kills me, it's me. I lay down my own life. And to go down into a deep, dark pit on our behalf and then fight his way out of it. Jesus is a warrior for our peace and for goodness. And if all of the armies that history has ever had were all stacked against the one person, Jesus Christ, Jesus would win. Amen. God himself could catch an atomic bomb in his little fingers and blow it out. Jesus is the bull in the china cabinet. Amen. Jesus is the wrecking ball to the structures of worldly powers that are around us. Jesus is the tour de force that can save our life against overwhelming odds and overwhelming adversity. And because of that, it is so right that we remember that we are created in his image and not the other way around. That we do not create for ourselves a tame, boring God that we have figured out that looks identical to all of our ideas and that always backs up our own lifestyles and all of our decisions. That's not what we do. That there are tables in our own lives that Jesus will kick down. And God is not afraid to do it because he is for us and not against us. During the liberal movements of theology, there was one movement called the Search for the Historical Jesus. And in that, they began to strip away all of Jesus's divinity and all of his power. And there was a saying about that movement that went like this, that liberal scholars looked down the long well of history and they found a Jesus whose reflection looked a lot like them. Taming God to such an extent that we have created him in our own image, the way that we want him to be. There's a poem about a little boy with a stuffed lion, and it's entitled The Eternal Plaything, and it considers how nice and carefree it is to play with a stuffed toy lion, and it suggests that with a stuffed toy, we can manipulate it or make it do anything that we want as we play with it as we please. But you better watch out if the lion comes to life. At that moment, all of our own control comes to an end. We have no control at that point. And so, of course, the little boy would rather have a toy lion than a real lion. And toward the end of the poem, it says that the same thing is true, that we would also rather have a stuffed Jesus Christ rather than the real one, a tame Jesus, so that we're not embarrassed by him, the kind of Jesus that we can adorn our houses and our churches with and decorate with him, but a Jesus that does not embarrass us. Because we want a Jesus that we make and a God we make in our own image. And it ends by saying this, that we want no more of Christ than is displayed in the lifeless playthings created by our own hands. It lulls our fears and it comforts our loss. A wooden Christ upon a wooden cross. And so I wonder, what tables might Jesus Christ overturn in your life? Proverbs 1:7 is still true, that the fear of God is still the beginning of wisdom.
You've been watching the video sermon podcast of First Baptist Church of Marble Falls, Texas. Never miss an archived sermon or video posted to our YouTube channel by subscribing to it at youtube.com/FBCMF2. For more information about our church and to hear an audio-only version of this sermon, please visit us online at fbcmf.org.